And let's learn about marijuana. So,
That guy's not having a good time.
no, that guy's actually not having a good time. And Jessica, that image is just for you, because that's a guy who had a bad reaction to synthetic marijuana. Yeah.
Well, at least he lived. Kind of.
Yeah, but he looks like he would rather not have. I mean, with that facial expression. So we'll talk a little bit about synthetic marijuana as well. I think we can go through most of this pretty quickly. There you go. There's your marijuana plant, in case you guys have never seen that. There are a ton of chemicals in the marijuana plant. Some of them, multiple chemicals in there, actually have some sort of action on your brain and central nervous system, on your peripheral nervous system, other parts of your body. The main guy is going to be THC, right? That's the main one that has the psychoactive properties, right, that you're thinking about. You're trying to get that, sort of effect. So there you go. I think you guys know most of the ways that you can ingest marijuana, right? I mean, I love the names that you don't realize like how ridiculous they sound until you read them like in a textbook, and you're like, hey man, who wants a spliff? Like, I don't know if a guy asks me about that on the street, like if I'm gonna go, I don't know.
I feel like this is outdated.
Some of it is, and this stuff changes all the time, right?
I'd say mold. Yeah, it's not a good time.
There you go. I don't know. People make all these fun genetic strains of marijuana, right, for different reasons. Most of the time, I mean, you're really just trying to get the THC content up, right? I mean, if you're gonna make something, you might as well try to increase the potency, right? That makes a lot of sense from some sort of marketing standpoint, right? You get your extra strength Tylenol. I don't know. Seems like a reasonable thing to do. Which can be a problem. I mean, people always say like, oh, well, the marijuana today is so much stronger than the marijuana when I was a kid. Yeah, but you're still probably not going to die from it, so I don't know that makes like a real difference in your life.
Quit being a pussy.
What? I didn't hear the first part of that. I heard the last part. So that's fine. So no worries. I mean, like, here's this great chart. This is based on like DEA seizures. So like the DEA will come around and take your marijuana. I don't know if you guys know that. And they like try to like analyze the THC content. So it's like some steady increase, but I don't know. People got lazy, I guess, there for a couple years and then down. Right? It's just interesting. Again, I obviously there is 4% to 12% is a big difference, right? But the margin of safety on marijuana, I mean, like natural marijuana, synthetic marijuana, just is a completely different thing. Keep that in mind. But I think exactly no one has ever died of a marijuana overdose. So there's that. It's not. I'm not saying it's like safe and you guys should just go out and smoke marijuana all day long. That's a whole different. It's a whole different thing, right? Because you have to think about some of these other issues. Again, there are like a ton of ways that you can get marijuana, that you can get this. We talked about this with other drugs. It's not a big deal. You can, I would never use something called earwax, just as a heads up there. If I was going to use something with a street name, Jason, I'm going to pick something a little better. So there you go. That just looks like, I know, look, I was thinking like baker's chocolate, right? I mean, this looks like baker's. So there you go. There's another way you can just go to your local Kroger, buy some baker's chocolate.
Sell it.
Crumble it up a little bit.
Taste bad. They probably wouldn't even notice.
They're going to smoke it anyway.
There you go. Have fun with
Don't even
that. I mean, cannabis probably started in China. Being good old Napoleon, I mean, he's responsible for bringing it to Europe, so that's great. I mean, guys, nobody celebrates Napoleon when they get around to like celebrating marijuana culture, right? I mean, it's just like why is he not like the figurehead of that movement? I don't know, right? Why are there other people? I mean, I'm thinking about like the other people who I think like are like, associated with that. But Napoleon's never one of them, is he? But that's sad, because he did so much. He did so much.
For his country.
Yeah, I mean, there he is. You can kind of look at this great chart, obviously not to scale, because like, you know, this is like 60 years, and this is like 6,000. So it's not to scale. So don't be confused by that. Think like, wow, look how fast, you know. No, so there you go. I mean, marijuana's been used for as long as it's been growing on this planet, right? Which is a pretty safe assumption. And for the most part, for most of that time, everybody was cool with that, right? So like, okay, we're great, you know, whatever. And then again, you know, 75 or 80 years ago, somebody said, I don't think so. We decided that was a bad idea, and so we started briefly saying like that's really illegal and something you shouldn't do. And then there's like been this kind of like reversal on that. Right now it's like, I mean, the great country of Canada just said, hey, coast to coast, marijuana is great. So they just legalized it nationwide. I don't know if you guys have been following that story, especially for those of you that almost live in Canada, right? I mean, isn't Cleveland almost Canada?
No.
I mean, not culturally or in terms of manners, but geographically.
I'm not from Cleveland. I'm from like middle of the state.
Oh,
like
that's even worse.
just really north, like north.
You're
You're from
not
like
the
middle.
middle.
of
You're
the
from like
state.
40 minutes from the Great Lakes.
That's, I mean, like the middle. Like Cleveland's
Great
over
Lakes.
here. I'm like directly in the middle of Ohio at the very top.
Oh.
Wherever you start seeing more
You're in the
cemeteries,
middle
that's
at
where
the
this
top.
gets from.
In the middle, at, like here's Ohio, and then I'm like right in the middle at the top. Not over here. Cleveland's over here.
40 minutes from the lakes.
That's almost Canada.
It's almost-
I mean, once
My
you get to
cousins
Great
are in
Lakes,
Canada. They're pretty excited about the whole
I would say
marijuana
so,
thing.
right? I mean, because
Yeah.
it's like a big deal, right?
It's
Which
very
is really
trendy right
what's
now.
sort of holding up things here. Even once states decide, like, hey, it's cool for you to use marijuana in this state, the feds can still get you. And so you got to watch out for that. And that's like did we talk about that in this class with the medical marijuana and like how lawyers can't help folks set up dispensaries. We talked about that, right, Destiny? I'm glad you remember that. Somebody pay attention. But because it's still illegal on federal level, even though the state of West Virginia said yes, you can use this in medical situations under these like very tight guidelines, lawyers can't participate in, you know, the legal steps to get you a business started. Some banks may not even, you know, work with you if they would lose their ability, right? Because they have these different licenses and things they have to follow. So it really sort of creates a problem, you know, for the growth of that industry and help those individuals. And we'll talk a bit about medical marijuana. I think people always think like, oh yeah, medical marijuana, that's great. Let's give it to these cancer patients and they're going to be awesome. But you know, you think about like, why does that help? Why does that do anything for anybody? What are the, you know, the sort of beneficial effects of marijuana? I think most folks are aware of what some of those are, but we'll talk about that. I don't know. Anybody seen Reefer Madness? I love those propaganda films. I don't know. There you go. I love old movie posters. That's a classic right there.
Let them cry for at midnight. The sweet pill that makes life bitter.
I know, right? Right? I mean, it's just.
Why is pill in quotations?
I mean, you realize it's, at that time at least, not really in pill form, right? I mean, we have pill form now, but I think they
So
were
it's
using.
called a pill?
No, I think they were just saying like,
Like the magic fix.
yeah, there you go. Clevelanders get this stuff quickly. Youthful marijuana victims. I love that they call them victims here, right? They look youthful. This guy looks like he's 45.
He made the poster.
He made the poster. Yeah. Quite youthful.
Looks like Don Draper.
What?
Looks like Don Draper.
Yeah. I don't know. I watched like 4 episodes of that show.
You gotta keep watching.
Yeah.
No.
No, you don't.
Yes.
What show?
Did you say Don Draper? Like
Yeah.
Mad Men?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a kick-ass show.
I watched 4 episodes. And then I think something important came along.
Another show.
Life. I'm not sure. what do we need to know here? I mean, it wasn't until the 60s that they actually figured out THC was like what's, you know, everybody was like, yeah, definitely smoking marijuana will give you these sort of feelings, but nobody understood what the chemical was, right? And so since then, obviously, you can sort of pull out the different chemicals and do different things. So there you go. Most of the time we think about smoking marijuana, but there are all kinds of other ways now, right? You can get these things in different forms. Don't worry about that. I mean, you guys aren't really going to be too interested. What is really interesting about your cannabinoids is they're extremely lipid soluble, right? So they're just going to like slide right through all of your cells, which is pretty awesome. All of the other, because you have to think about, there are like two kinds of cannabinoids. There's what we call phytocannabinoids. That's stuff that comes from plants, right? Because of the phyto part there. And then there are endocannabinoids, and those are the cannabinoids that you make. We'll talk about some of those as well. They're basically the same. They're just coming from two different sources. They have slightly different structures, but they're both, again, very lipid soluble. What's kind of interesting about this, Jason, is previously we've always talked about neurotransmitters, right? And we've talked about just like putting them in vesicles and then just dumping them out later. The problem with your endocannabinoids is they're so lipid soluble, if you put them in a vesicle, they fall out. And so you don't really make endocannabinoids ahead of time. You just make them when you need them, and they'll just like slide right out. It's pretty cool. And they actually work a lot like, I don't think we talked a whole lot about nitric oxide, but there's a thing called like retrograde signaling. So even the postsynaptic cell can release endocannabinoids, and they can float back to the presynaptic cell, so they can have action that way, which is really kind of a fascinating direction of action. I don't really think about the other. So there you go. I mean, this is just, you know, time. I mean, you take some THC, you get a big increase. Over time, it drops off. You know, it takes a couple hours. Your THC metabolites, though, will hang around for a long time, right? They've got a pretty long half-life in general, and so you can test even a couple weeks out for marijuana use, which is kind of interesting. And later, this actually, so for you, like practically, that has some sort of implications, right? When you start thinking about, Jessica's really nodding her head there, because you can check these guys all the time for marijuana use, even to some extent in the past. What's also interesting about this is later when we start talking and thinking about, and I guess we can do this now, like, is marijuana addictive in the same way that other drugs are, right? And so the evidence on that is really conflicting, right? And so when they try to create self-administration setups with animals, when they do withdrawal sort of things, when you start thinking about this, the mechanisms are a little different, and the process is a little different compared to something like amphetamine, right? It doesn't really have the exact same action. Definitely, marijuana use is rewarding, right? THC definitely increases dopamine where, Jessica?
In the nucleus accumbens.
Absolutely, right? But it doesn't do it in the same way that, or to the same sort of degree that you get with some other drugs, right? I mean, it's still going to be a rewarding thing, but it's not going to be something that's going to be a problem. And in fact, like only like 10% of people who try marijuana actually develop some sort of problematic use, right? And marijuana has some negative side effects, has some problems, some health consequences. There's some cognitive impairments, psychomotor impairments is like a big deal if you're using marijuana, at least in the acute sense, right? And so if you're constantly and continuously taking something that's going to decrease your psychomotor sort of abilities, then that's going to either A, limit the things you should do, like operate heavy machinery, or B, cause you to create problems when you do those things you shouldn't do while you're under that influence. So that can be problematic. But in terms of withdrawal, so I mean, when you use marijuana, like what are sort of you guys can throw these out in a fun fashion. What are some of the effects, right, of marijuana? You have sort of relaxation, reduced anxiety typically, right? So it has some action there. We'll talk about some specifics. Increased appetite, is another effect of marijuana use, right? This is one of many reasons that they will, you can use marijuana medically for folks who have like wasting diseases, right? Because it will increase their appetite. If you're having a problem in the other direction, you can actually, there are different cannabinoid receptors. There's the CB1 receptor, which is primarily in the central nervous system, and the CB2, which is mostly in other places like adipose tissue, bone. It's kind of interesting. Other organs. But if you were to block your CB1 receptors, there are certain drugs that they'll do that, right? Which will cause you to sort of decrease your food intake, which is kind of fascinating. But withdrawal from marijuana, I mean, some people experience withdrawal from marijuana use, right? The withdrawal effects really aren't that different than if you're withdrawing from other sort of drugs that, you know, actually they're not that much different than withdrawal from nicotine, for example. But you do tend to have a little bit of increase in irritability if you're withdrawing from marijuana. Makes some sense, right? If what you were doing was getting you like really relaxed and you sort of all of a sudden stop, you might be a little irritable. And you'll have a decrease in appetite. You could have a couple other things going on. Doesn't happen a lot, and part of the reason for this is it's that extended half-life. So they do these studies in animals sometimes, right? And so if you really wanted to look at withdrawal effects of a drug, just pump an animal full of that drug and then take that drug away and see how they behave, right? And see what happens. This is what we do with any kind of drug. When you do this with marijuana and you just load up a rat with a bunch of marijuana and then you take that marijuana away, you don't really see any withdrawal effects at all. They're just kind of like, you know, whatever. And they're just kind of hanging out. And part of that's because of, again, that extended half-life. So you're kind of, you know, if you think about when you're coming off of, what do they give you if you're coming off of heroin, for example, right? They're going to give you kind of a reduced step, right, over some time. And, you know, we talked about that. THC kind of has its own reduced step because it has that extended half-life, right? They can kind of bring it down a little bit. Which would decrease the likelihood, you would think, of relapse, right? Because you don't have that sort of immediate, abrupt, you know, extreme withdrawal.
I know you said we're going to talk about synthetic marijuana later, but does it work in similar ways, like with the extended half-life and with everything we've been talking about with marijuana?
Yes and no. And the reason I say yes and no is there are probably several hundred different synthetic marijuanas, right? Or synthetic THC. And so they're not, and it's important actually, it's synthetic THC and not synthetic marijuana, even though that's what we say. Marijuana itself, again, has, in particular, cannabidiol, right? So CBD is another major and important component of marijuana that actually has some effects. There's actually some consideration for using CBD for, like, you know, as an anti-epileptic, for some other issues. CBD may also protect you against some of the, you know, the psychiatric sort of the issues that you might have. If you think about, again, we talked about there are more psychotic episodes with, you know, synthetic versus natural, right? Part of that is because when you're taking these synthetic preparations, typically it's only a synthetic THC and you're not getting the CBD in there as well. So you're only getting one of the many chemicals that are going to be in the natural, you know, the natural marijuana plant. So because you don't have those other chemicals sort of mediating other effects, right, and other actions, you're more likely to get just that kind of immediate thing. On top of that, all of these synthetic substances are manipulations of that structure, and at some point they're going to have a completely different action, right? I mean, once you manipulate the structure enough, it's going to have different actions. It's not going to have the same, work through the same mechanism, so the response you get might be different, even though some of them may be similar, might have some similar action. In fact, THC itself is not like a really great cannabidiol receptor agonist. It's only a partial agonist, right? So when you're taking, you know, when you're using marijuana, you're not getting like a full-on agonist. I mean, if we start thinking about, like when we talked about cocaine and amphetamine and the things it would, I mean, that was working at multiple levels, right, on those on a dopamine system. But THC is kind of like just a partial agonist for your cannabinoid receptor, whereas your synthetics are full agonists, right? And so they're going to be more potent. They typically, the onset of the high is, that latency is shorter. So when you take a synthetic, you seem to have a more rapid onset and a more powerful onset. However, there have been numerous studies where they would give people the option between sort of natural marijuana and synthetics, and they would typically choose the natural marijuana. Obviously, for that sort of side effect profile is much better. So that's interesting, right? Because you would think, I mean, synthetics are appealing for a couple reasons. One, they're easy to get. They're easy to conceal, right? If you wanted to smoke a marijuana cigarette right now, Montana, that would be difficult to do without me noticing, right? I mean, you could try it, but I'm probably going to notice. But if you wanted to use a synthetic, it's easier to conceal, right? There are other sort of routes of administration that folks can use, and they are often, because they're not THC. Jessica, when you go to collect samples, I don't know if you do that or not. Okay, somebody else does, right? Somebody else has got they've got one of those like old lady grabber things with a cup so they can stand really far away and collect samples. I don't know, is that how they do it?
I don't know.
You don't know.
Ask questions like that.
You should ask. A lot of the tests that they use are not testing for these synthetics. Partly because they don't even know some of these synthetics exist until a number of people have had psychotic episodes. And you come in and they're like, hey, there's this weird chemical that we found in these like 15 people who all said they used this, whatever the new name is for whatever synthetic that is, right? So the designer drug makers are constantly trying to outrun legislation that's banning those drugs because they're different substances, right? Interesting.
Yeah, I was gonna ask, like, there for a while, they would ban like one particular synthetic, like there was like JWH018, something like that.
Yeah, yeah.
And they banned that, and then something else would come along. Like, are all of those chemicals, do they like resemble THC at like the molecular level?
They do.
Is that?
They do. Now they are different, and they're different enough that they're not going to show up as THC on the test. So when you test someone for one of these, when you give someone a drug test, your typical drug test is not going to test for all of these potential synthetics that are out there. On top of that, even if today I designed a drug test that tested for every synthetic marijuana available, tomorrow some guy's going to come up with a new synthetic, and my test isn't going to be good enough for that. So you're constantly, it's like an arms race between those drug designers and the legislation. It's kind of interesting. But they resemble THC enough so that you get a similar sort of effect profile, right? I mean, at some point, if you were to hang enough things off of there, then it's not going to be effective. And I'm certain the reason they get names like JWH108 is because there was also a 107 and a 106 and a 105, right? That didn't work at all. And so they was like, well, that one didn't work. And so they have to kind of luck upon that particular shape, different enough from THC not to be detected and not to be marked as illegal, but similar enough to still have a desirable action. So there
Do
you
the synthetic things have the same like chemical compound, or like
the central part's going to be pretty similar.
that's going to be the
Like this is, but you can hang different like little groups off of here or down here, and you can make these. Well, we can just since you guys are really interested. I'm actually almost at the point of tears because, like so many of you are excited about the chemical structure of synthetic marijuana. I'm just.
Well, I didn't really think about it before, but for some reason today I was thinking like, you can have, and I forget the word, but like you can have the same exact molecule, like the same things are in it, but if it's turned a certain way, it does a totally different thing.
Yeah. Actually, here's a pretty good. I mean, here's your 018s, your 175. These are just different. And you can see that some of these are similar, but here's one that gets quite a bit different. Here's like a whole group. of these. They're just, they're just naming them, different things. And these are these are actually metabolites, so that's one reason they're kind of different. They're those GWH. Let's see, what do we got here? That's CBD. But they all will have some similar similar structure. You'll be able to sort of notice the like some of the structures are going to be similar, even though these are in a slightly different orientation. But it is the structure that's important. If you make something that's completely different structure, or the compounds are different, they're not going to be able to for some reason that one didn't come through clearly. I thought it was going to be a great image. But if you don't, I don't know where I was going with that, but if you don't have the similar structure, then it's not going to be able to activate that receptor, right? So it has to have some key components that are the same. So if you kind of look at the structure of that, and then here's the structure of your, and then you can kind of see you have these tails coming off of some rings, even though you have some extra rings, and you have some units here in the middle, these oxygens that sort of open that shape up a little bit, right? And they kind of bend things around. But if you were to think about, particularly like this example, if you were to get rid of this oxygen, and then this could just kind of bend, right back in there, and you're really looking at a very similar structure. So as long as the chemical structure is close enough, it'll work. It may not work perfectly. It actually may work more than perfectly. And that's the problem with these synthetics is this design. This structure is a partial agonist. These structures could be full agonists, right? So they could have higher affinity for that cannabinoid receptor, and they can cause, a stronger or longer lasting effect.
Is that why people die, or do they die from other stuff in the synthetic?
Yeah, so there are some side effects with marijuana. There is like a slight increase in cardiovascular events, right? So folks who use marijuana are at a slightly higher risk to have, like heart attacks or something. There are also some, some problems with, your vascular, even sort of secondhand marijuana smoke can cause problems with your, your blood vessels and so forth, right? So you have some problems there. Folks who use synthetic marijuana, there's a much higher likelihood of those sort of cardiac events, and that's one of the more detrimental things that's going to happen. And this is even controlled for age, so this isn't just like old hippies smoking marijuana and trying something new and then having a heart attack from it because they're like 75. This is even folks in their 20s and 30s who use these things that can still cause problems.
So is it like an overdose of THC, or is that not the right term? Or overdose of big THC?
You definitely can, and that's actually, so the way you typically use a synthetic is it comes in like a powdered form, and there are a couple ways you can use this, right? So a lot of people would just like spray it. You can kind of like make it, like put it in some water or something, and you can like spray it on another plant, and then take that plant and roll it and smoke it.
Sounds like a lot of work.
It does sound like a lot of work, right? I mean, you're thinking about it as like why am I going through all of that? There are other ways that you can get this as well, right? I mean, there are other sort of, you can vaporize it, you can do other things.
In the prison, they make a tea out of it.
Yeah, well, that sounds like something.
Mm-hmm.
What other plant would you spray that on? Why would you smoke
It was sold as incense when I was in high school. Like they would have like mullein or like marshmallow leaf, and it would just be sprayed onto that.
Yeah.
So I remember that. You could
Herbal-
buy it at like head shops. and
Yeah,
whatever.
but I
Herbal
just assumed
incense,
that's
not for
what it
human
was. It wasn't
consumption,
on
is
another
typically
plant.
what it would say. And then, so like, oh yeah, we're just gonna like burn that off in a field there where nobody's gonna be around it. That's exactly what we're gonna do. So the problem is, they call it hot spots. So you may not actually have equally distributed the synthetic marijuana everywhere on those leaves, and you could get a bunch of it in one place, and that's gonna suddenly hit you, right? If you're smoking a marijuana plant, the THC is pretty equally distributed throughout that plant, right? So you're gonna get that. What's gonna be the variable way is how you administer that, right? And so like, how fast are you trying to smoke this, or what kind of dosing are you taking? Not the actual chemical itself, it's going to be equally distributed. But with the synthetics, the way that you would use those are not often equally distributed. So there you go, that's kind of interesting, right?
Like Russian roulette.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, right? So like, in general, I mean, go natural. Like, if you're going to do something, that's just my suggestion to you. I'm not, again, putting an endorsement on you going out and using marijuana, so that's just, especially for those of you that work in places that drug test, right? So I would definitely not recommend that if you want to keep your job, because they're gonna, and like your position here, right? Because they do drug tests. I just wanted to like be clear about that. Not that anybody's gonna like turn you in for something like that. But now I'm wondering like if they need to like change their, I don't know. Long story. I just think about things. Because there are all kinds of drugs you can use that have major effects on your like judgment. And then there are other drugs that you can't use that, I mean, they have effects on your judgment too, but temporarily. It's the same, right? I don't.
What are you saying?
I'm saying like you can
Like
go
you can
drink
show
as
up.
much as
Yeah.
you want.
Okay.
As long as when
That's
you
where
come
we
in
are.
on Monday morning, you're sober, right? We don't care what you did Saturday night, if it's alcohol. We do care what you did Saturday night if it was marijuana, because 2 weeks later, like on some random Tuesday, we'll test you, right, Jason?
Right, so which means if you're vacationing in Colorado,
Stay for 3
you
weeks.
can get drug tested when you get home.
Stay for 3 weeks, do what you want the first week, take the second week light, and then come home. So that's,
Second week light.
yeah, just,
This is all on the record.
I mean, if you guys weren't smart enough to think about it, you're not smart enough to pull it off. So I'm not worried about it. I mean, Jason's the one who thought of the problem. Are you planning
Are
a
you
trip to
vacationing?
Colorado?
I'm actually from Colorado.
Oh. Visiting family for Thanksgiving. Wait until Christmas because you get more time off. Thanksgiving is it's basically a 4-day weekend. You don't have enough time. Yeah. See, we have these interesting conversations. Like, I really wanted to talk about so much else right now, but you guys are like really about something, which is exciting. I'm glad you get excited about something.
People are dying.
Huh?
People are dying.
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
marijuana, yeah.
Oh,
So
oh.
it's interesting.
Yeah, well, it's a problem because, like, I know a bunch of guys in the military who smoke that stuff, and that's not good.
Whoa, that's bad.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, especially when you're already in a situation that's stressful and might cause you some anxiety.
Yeah.
And then you're gonna take something that has like I mean, compared to marijuana, natural marijuana, a higher chance of causing you some adverse effects.
But they can't smoke marijuana.
Yeah, they can they?
Mhm.
Forgot about that.
So that's why they do that, which is dangerous. and
It is
bad.
dangerous. It is
That's-
dangerous.
Have you heard about the guys who, like, overdose on it and then they're in trouble
Yeah,
in the military?
yeah, it happens.
So do we have any idea why it causes anxiety in some people and relaxes others?
Marijuana? Well, probably what prevents you from having, because most of the time, it's going to be a relaxing effect, right? It's kind of a rare time when you're going to have the anxiety to the point like it's a problem, right? Like because if it was like a 50-50 shot, you'd find something else to do, right? I mean, so think about it. It's like just naturally, if I say, here's some marijuana, half the time you take it, you're going to feel good, the other half you're not. And then over here is product B, and like 90% of the time you're going to feel good, and 10% of the time you're not. You're going to go to product B, right? But marijuana is the, I mean, it's the #1 illicit drug in the United States, in a lot of countries, a lot of places. People have been using it for centuries because most of the time you get the desired effect, right? So you're going to keep using it. Those times when you don't, I think it's probably related actually to the CBD component, because that seems to be protective of those adverse effects. which is really kind of interesting. And that's why with the synthetics you don't have that component, so you don't have any protection at all. And then when you do administer CBD, it seems as though so you have a reduction in that. So there's some mechanism through through some other receptors in that other molecule. So that seems to play an important component in sort of maintaining that, that calmness. Which is one reason that CBD is considered for a therapeutic agent, because it doesn't have the psychoactive sort of effects of THC, but you might still get some of those beneficial effects that you're looking for. So that's interesting, right? You gotta move so much faster if you want to hear about the Russian torpedo. I mean, if you're excited about that. Oh, there's CBD, right? We just talked about that. Great job, Jason, stealing my punchline.
I'm still curious about why people who smoke weed are at a higher risk of having heart attacks and vascular problems. Is it because it just, like, if you're calm, like, your blood vessels are gonna be more dilated? Like, is that the issue? Like, that they're that, I guess there's so much blood flow for so long? Does that make sense?
Yeah, there are other effects. So you have the CB2 receptor. I mean, this guy's even out in your immune system. And this is something, too, that we see in chronic marijuana users, is a decrease in their immune system function. Because it'll actually, which can actually be used to your advantage sometimes. Because it'll reduce like cytokine activity, it'll reduce some things like that, which is great if you have like an autoimmune disease, right? So marijuana would be, I mean, that's one thing you don't think about, right? Like, why we think about giving people marijuana for things when they need to eat, things when they're dealing with some pain. So cannabinoids are really great at dealing with neuropathic pain, like pain that's not because you smashed your finger, but pain that is originating somewhere like in your central nervous system. Opioids are not very good at that. So you could pump somebody full of morphine, and if it's neuropathic pain, it's not really going to work very well. But because cannabinoids work on a different receptor in different places, they can actually alleviate that pain. So that's that's another potential use. But you think about people getting organ transplants, right? So knocking down their immune system a little bit so they can accept that is actually an interesting application, right? We didn't think about that. No, always thinking about the other stuff.
Not with autoimmune diseases, then.
No. Yeah, but it does decrease. Your immune system function.
So you said you have to have a decrease in that to get a transplant? Like your body will reject it?
Yeah. Most of the time, if you have an organ transplant, that's from someone else. I know that sounded ridiculous, but there are ways you could self-donate, right? Like certain tissues, right? You could grow something, right? Megan knows all about this.
Butt cheek grafts.
Butt cheek grafts. Yeah.
All about it.
I'm not gonna ask.
I'm gonna be quiet.
Yeah, I'm going to.
You're all about it.
Like third-degree burns. You get a little butt cheek on your face, and you're good to go.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna be quiet.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah.
You're welcome to do that.
Make an ass out of yourself. Good joke.
What a zinger. Aww. She loves you.
Yeah, I would have moved on that one.
Or Brazilian supplements. They transfer fat from your stomach to your butt.
Yeah, there you go. That's something.
He has
Or
butt,
when
well,
they
had
take
butt
a
skin
piece
on
of
his
your
face. He blew his jaw.
put it up here.
Yep, that happens too.
Ew,
You can do
wow.
that with your boobs too.
So
If you're getting
puke a
a
little.
recovery, a reconstruction after
Okay.
surgery, and like if you have, say you have like a mole on your stomach, it'll be up there now.
Okay.
Isn't that creepy?
I was following Destiny's story about taking your intestine and putting it in your throat, and I was really curious about how that would work. It's creating some interesting imagery. But I'm glad you were talking about something completely different, because that makes my world make a lot more sense.
Does that? Is that a thing?
Yeah.
I mean, it's the same. Yeah, whatever's in you is in you, right? It's the same stuff. But if you're getting an organ transplant from someone else, your body will identify it. We could really talk about this major histocompatibility complex if you want to, but we don't have to. Your body will identify it as not yours, and it will kill it. It'll try to destroy it. And so anytime you get, if you were to get like a kidney transplant, if you were to get, like a lung transplant, heart transplant, something like that, you would need to reduce your immune system function. And so those
So
folks.
it can't have the power to kill it.
Yeah.
But
and
then
so-
it also like can't fight infection.
Yeah, that's the real problem, right? But then you gotta like kind of roll the dice on that, right? Like, well, my heart's not good, so I'm definitely gonna die. Or I'll take a chance on an infection later, and
It might die.
What's the organ that you can give away and it doesn't kill you? Or
One
not?
kidney.
Heart.
Are you talking about the kidney?
like one kidney.
The liver
Okay.
regrows if that's what
Your liver does,
you get low.
and you can actually donate part of your liver to someone, and they can stick that in them, and your liver will,
Regenerate.
Yeah.
But you can give up a kidney too.
Yeah, you can give up one kidney. You have two most of the time.
But you gotta keep
If
it.
for some reason you only had one, you'd have to keep that one.
Yeah, I might give
No
somebody a
more
kidney
like-
someday. That'd be
No
nice.
more like soccer for you.
Soccer.
Right? You're not supposed to do like those types of activities.
Why can't you play soccer if you only have one kidney?
Well, you weren't supposed to like do anything that could like risk danger to the other kidney, because now you only have one.
Oh,
Take care of that shit.
Yeah.
I guess.
Well, it'd be like really nice though. Like, here's a Christmas present.
Here's a like,
You never know. Some
here's
people
a
need them.
weird like thought. Because
Christmas
when we're talking about like how certain
Yeah.
weeks
All right, guys, we got
are-
something over here.
Yeah, this is probably bad that it's gonna be on the record, but who cares, I don't. So, if it's better to smoke weed when you have an organ transplant to lower your immune system, could there be a way that they could use that with women who have multiple miscarriages because their body's rejecting that?
Whoa.
Because you can't use drugs while you're pregnant because it's gonna
Yeah.
fuck up the baby.
Yeah. So you
But-
definitely shouldn't. So just as like, let's throw this out there. The big disclaimer: you should not smoke really anything while you're pregnant. I think if you were to, so there are other ways, of course, you can use marijuana besides smoking, right? I mean, there are other routes of administration that are available. So let's say we get this in some sort of other form that's not smoking, which is the other issue, because there are, when you do smoke marijuana, there are still, that profile is a little different than what you have with like a tobacco cigarette, but you still actually have those same carcinogens are present when you smoke. Marijuana or tobacco is the same. The psychoactive ingredient is different, but some of the things are the same. And there's always that like, well, maybe I'm smoking less, but it's more concentrated. Does that matter? You can still cause serious lung damage smoking anything, right? So that's one thing to think about. So that's why like other edibles, oils, those are safer for your lungs. I still would not recommend using THC or any other psychoactive. That's the problem, because and then it has effects on development, right?
Right.
To a hippie.
What?
You give birth to a hippie.
Yeah. Gotta watch that.
That's how it happens.
I think will come out with Birkenstocks and a poncho.
I don't know, I'm just,
Driving a Volkswagen bus.
I guess I've just seen a lot of people recently, and this is just from Facebook, who are like, have had miscarriages, and now
Yeah.
they're pregnant again, and like, they're all hoping that it'll be fine, they're on their rainbow babies and everything. But I was just thinking, like, if there's
Yeah.
something that you could do to keep your body from fighting off that.
That's when your first baby dies.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Didn't know what that term
Yeah.
was.
They didn't know rainbow babies.
Oh, yeah, it's the next baby that you have after a miscarriage.
It has nothing to do with jaundice.
No.
They're yellow.
What I would do if I were you, if this happens to you, which it just sounds like it does, I would counsel them to just not have kids.
For sure.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't mean that in like a hard, callous way. I just mean if you're continuing to have problems, you're gonna,
Right.
possible problems with you, you're gonna continue to go through that emotional sort sort of roller coaster, and that's gonna be bad. And then, you know, you're gonna,
You know,
yeah, there's all kinds of things you can do, right?
we should go buy one.
Here's your brain, if you were a rat. Which is kind of interesting, Corey, I think, because it's showing you where there are these like high concentrations of your cannabinoid receptors. Substantia nigra, your globus pallidus, cutting, containment, these are all involved in like motor, right? Because we know that when the dopamine cells die in the substantia nigra, then you develop Parkinson's disease, right? So some of the psychomotor effects, cerebellum as well. Also out here in your hippocampus. I'm not sure if you guys are aware that smoking marijuana does affect your memory, right? That is what I would say is an acute effect, not necessarily a. So for those of you that forgot what acute means, that means kind of like right at that time, right? It's not necessarily a long-term effect, which is really another one of these sort of like broad things. People always tell you, like, I love those, one of the things I really love are those, like, this is your brain on drugs kind of things. I think those are fascinating, largely because the people who make those signs don't know what brains are or drugs, and so they're just like, two things I don't know about, but here they're bad. And I think that's something. You know, there's some evidence that, you know, people always say, oh, don't use, you know, marijuana will kill your brain cells. Well, lots of things will kill your brain cells. But, you know, I don't think using marijuana necessarily accelerates that process any more than anything else. The acute effects are obvious, right? There are cognitive deficits if you're using marijuana right now. If you stop using marijuana, most of those cognitive deficits disappear, right? And there's not really any evidence that it's long lasting. Even, this is kind of something, so even when they start looking at, there were some studies where they've looked at like teenagers, right? Who started using marijuana maybe when they were, 14, 15, 16 years old, right? And then they'll look at those guys later. Now, in the short term, if you're using marijuana every day or 2 or 3 times a week, you're not going to be doing that great in school, right? You're going to have a decrease in your scholastic performance. But there are many reasons why that might happen, right? Some of that is definitely going to be related to the effects of THC on your cognitive performance. Some of those effects may also be environmental, right? Because if you're, one thing that's kind of correlated with, sort of continued use or habitual use as an adolescent is sort of a home environment that's at least permissive of that behavior and probably not really encouraging you for higher scholastic attainment, right? And so when you start looking at these folks who maybe have gone down this other sort of cultural or subcultural path, however you want to look at that, destiny, they may have made other choices, right? And so of course they may not end up, with more advanced degrees than somebody in like another category. And that doesn't necessarily mean there's like an IQ deficit or anything.
How significant of like memory issues are we talking about? Like that acute period.
I mean, you're not going to forget your name.
I mean, if, like I'm talking about more of like if someone comes in and they have smoked right before a session, and I'm going to administer some type of test, right?
Oh, yeah.
Like how big of a difference is that going to make?
I mean, some of it depends on how much they've used. The other thing that's important is how much they've used. Did I mention that one?
Yeah.
Just wanted to repeat that. And I mean that in 2 different ways, right? There's a dose-dependent effect, but there's also behavioral tolerance. So if you are a repeated heavy user, that's the other thing. You're not really going to notice, their performance is not really. So if somebody comes in and I use marijuana every day and I've done that for, 5 years, probably not going to make a big difference. Their behavioral tolerance is going to be at a level where you're going to get what you're going to get out of it. You don't have to worry about it.
So then if that's happening in parallel with alcohol use over a long period of time.
Then you start to, when you're starting to mix other drugs in there, right, that becomes a real problem. And alcohol in particular, I mean, heavy alcohol use causes major structural changes to your brain, over time. And that's definitely gonna cause some serious alcohol use will cause you more problems than just about any other heavy drug use. The effects, I mean, there's a specific syndrome, not exactly but it's a vitamin deficiency, but it's typically brought on, Korsakoff's, right, is typically associated with alcoholics, and that's when you develop amnesia, and it's severe, and it's heavy, and it's irreversible. So I wouldn't worry. I mean, if somebody comes in and they're obviously like, just finished smoking in the car before they came to your appointment, you might not want to give them, like something like a CPT. See, I know one there, right? Is that one?
That's an attention test.
Yeah, I wouldn't give them that. I mean, they're just gonna be never hitting that space bar probably.
And they won't be worried about it.
No, they're not gonna be worried about it. And
Well,
they're
that's
yeah, and so but if you're dealing with someone who's a heavy user, or somebody who uses on I hate to say heavy user. I mean, that sounds kind of judgmental, but that's the terminology we use. If you have someone who has behavioral tolerance, they've been using marijuana for an extended period of time, you're probably not going to really notice a big difference.
Right, so it may not necessarily be the changes in structures, but it could cause changes in things like effort.
Yeah, so, I mean, that's part of why it's relaxing, is sort of, it's kind of interesting. It sort of has this negative feedback. So THC, through a series of mechanisms, has a negative feedback effect on glutamate release, right? And so that's one reason why as an anti-epileptic it'd be pretty awesome, right? Because massive glutamate release can cause you to have a serious seizure, right? So that's a problem. And so that can reduce activity in brain regions like, let's say, the hippocampus, where you need glutamate to do long-term potentiation, which is why you have memory problems, because you're directly interfering with that.
So is the memory deficit, is that more like in the encoding process instead of retrieval?
Yeah. So hippocampus is for sort of taking those short-term memories and putting them into long-term memories, right? So if you've lived somewhere for the last couple decades, and you're using marijuana, and you ask somebody, hey, where do you live? They could probably tell you where they live. But I would not get your buddy who is currently on marijuana to try to remember directions to a new place, right? That's not going to work, okay? Because hippocampus isn't really going to do that.
So in other words, that's going to really screw up any assessment you're going to get.
Yeah, I wouldn't let people, I wouldn't, if you could help it, give somebody an IQ test while they're, unless again, they're kind of like a repeat user who's developed behavioral tolerance to that, is probably
Yeah, so I was just thinking, I had a client in mind where they came in for some memory concerns, but they had significant history of alcohol use, plus marijuana use, plus family history of dementia. So it's I have to deal with it.
Get that guy a handler, because that's a triple threat right there.
Yeah.
If you've got a family history already of some degenerative issue with your brain, and then you're coupling that, particularly with the alcohol use. The marijuana use, once you stop, you pretty much recover whatever you weren't able. It's not really a loss; it's just sort of a temporary unavailability, right? It's sort of how I would think about that, rather than an absolute loss. Now, with heavy alcohol use, you're talking about an absolute loss, and you can lose some brain damage. Now, there are some studies, that being said, there are some studies where they look at individuals who are, and again, the real important thing here to keep in mind, Kristen, is we're really talking about 10% of the people who've ever used marijuana, right? We're not talking about the 90% of the people out there who, once in a while on a Saturday are like, man, it's been a rough week. I'm just going to smoke some marijuana. I don't know. I was going to say watch Westworld, but that's not a show you should ever watch on anything. You have to go into that. So I don't even like to smell rubbing alcohol before I watch it, because I know I'm going to miss something. But you might just sit down. I'm going to watch some, I don't know, Will and Grace reruns or something.
What shows do you like to watch after smelling rubbing alcohol?
That's a good question. You know what? I think I have some rubbing alcohol at home. I'm gonna go take a whiff tonight and then see what strikes my fancy on the television.
Expect to report
But anyway, there are some studies that have looked at brains of individuals who are heavy users. And there are some, prefrontal cortex seems to be a little smaller, hippocampus seems to be a little smaller. The problem with these studies is they're all cross-sectional, right? So I'm like randomly plucking a heavy user and saying, like, let me look at your brain. And then I'm randomly plucking someone who's never used it. I'm saying, like, let me look at your brain. I'm not tracking that person, from birth on up and checking to see if their actual, maybe their hippocampus was just smaller in the beginning. And is that the cause or the effect? You don't know. I mean, it could just be different. And that's part of the problem with a lot of these studies. Especially with something like marijuana that is sort of...
I've heard a lot of like the scare tactics with marijuana. I mean, I've heard people say that they tried it and have hallucinations. But I worked with a guy who smoked it pretty regularly for years on the weekends and whatnot. And he was actually my best salesman. He didn't leave the store, wasn't selling marijuana, but I mean, he had this really outgoing personality. Everybody liked to talk to him.
Yeah.
He wasn't anxious.
But it didn't seem to impact, anything, really. I mean, you couldn't tell that he was. It wasn't...
Yeah, I mean, it's... I wouldn't get in the car with that guy on the weekend.
No, probably.
Because there are those acute effects that you have to be concerned about. It's not like you can just use marijuana and you're fine to do whatever you want. But, yeah, a number of people are, and it's not just a new thing that they're long-term. I mean, historically, there are long-term users who seem to be perfectly fine. Yeah, I mean, again, don't smoke marijuana and get in the car or drive. That seems like a bad idea. But, if you're just hanging out at home on the weekend.
In Colorado.
In Colorado only, or, Jesse, people are visiting your cousins in Canada.
Don't do it live on the air.
Don't do it live on air.
Yeah.
Elon Musk.
Oh, Elon Musk. That guy's a weirdo. I mean, I'm not saying he's not brilliant, but I'm saying he's a weirdo.
Yeah, he's a little bit weird.
Yeah, he's a little bit weird. When he got obsessed with that submarine rescue guy.
Yeah.
I was like, that's a little over the line. Pull these kids out of a cave. That seems pretty awesome, if you ask me. I'm sorry you didn't get your magic sub in there first. Sure, somebody else will get trapped in a cave. You can use it for that. I mean, I don't know.
There will be more caves.
And then he was like, oh no, I didn't mean to call the guy a pedophile. And then later he said, yeah, I did.
Yeah.
Yeah, I did.
That's a very intentional word to use.
It's like, oh, I got that confused. I thought he was a guy who liked feet. I don't know. I think that would be a podophile. Podiatry. You guys probably know about what the technical term is for somebody with a foot fetish, right? Is that something you have to study?
It's just a fetish.
They're just all
specific
fetish.
to fetish.
It's just a whole group. There's not like
There's a whole group of weirdos.
If you like a particular body part, it's called partialism or something like that, and it means that there's a particular thing, but I don't know if it goes further than that.
But it's only diagnosable if it's problematic, though. So you can't be kink shaming.
Yeah.
You should start calling it autophagia, because, be very clear to pronounce the because that can get really confusing. But it's like podiatry. You're writing that down.
Oh, yeah.
No,
You get shanked or you just...
You're right.
All right, let's try to move through this, because I did want to talk about hallucinogens, and we've almost used an entire hour and 15 minutes this class. I know we lost so much of it to Dr. Maywald. Sorry, Steve. Surprised he didn't have on a pith helmet. Long term. We've already froze up. We've already talked a lot about this. these are your endogenous cannabinoids. That's not, I mean, it's interesting, but it's not going to be. We talked about this. Just want to make sure there's nothing else. If you smoke marijuana and then you try to do some fear conditioning, doesn't work. Which is actually pretty fascinating. Because fear conditioning is like such a powerful thing. So you can administer marijuana to, or cannabinoids or endocannabinoids, in fact, to rats, and then try to put them through like this like tone shock kind of thing. So it's really interesting. So it's like, one is like, well, is that like a learning issue, or two is like somehow, you know, just not fear, right? Which is kind of fascinating. So there you go. He's listening to an announcement. All rats, please visit the principal's office. I don't know. So PTSD, that's like a big one, right? So using, cannabinoids to treat PTSD sounds like something that could really be effective, right? I mean, we already sort of, and we'll talk maybe a little bit about ketamine more later, but we talked about ketamine being a great preventer of PTSD, right? Because like, whoa, I just had this really horrible event. Let's give you some ketamine so it interferes with that NMDA process, right, and your long-term potentiation and so forth. Cannabinoids can help with that as well. I talked about hunger, reduced pain, neuropathic pain.
So the web box talked about the use for PTSD and depression as well on the CB1 receptor. And I've always heard about like not using a depressant to treat depression. I thought that was interesting. I was wondering why that was.
So I think so sometimes you have to think about, it's all about wiring diagrams. So I'm going to ask you the opposite question, because we already talked about this. Why would we give someone a stimulant to treat ADHD, right? Because it's not global. We're targeting specific areas. And so if we can inhibit inhibitors, well, that seems like a positive effect.
So since the CB1 receptor, or the CB1 is in a particular area of the nervous system.
Yeah.
And you're affecting it there and not in the other places.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
It's pretty awesome, right? So there you go. All depressed people should smoke marijuana. You heard it from Destiny.
Oh, don't tell Kennedy that was said.
She not approve of that?
No.
Because they still come in.
Because they still have problems. Their depression isn't fixed.
They might still come in. They also may not have the motivation to do that.
So then they're cured.
If they're not in your office, I think so, right?
If you don't see them again, they must be cured. That's how I
So
saw
many people.
Unless you call them back down before you get rid of them.
Oh, jeez. Hey, who loves monkeys? Hey, actually, we should talk about like another side effect of, well, I'm just like clicking through this to make sure there's like nothing else that I need to tell you, because I think we've already talked about most of this. There are some effects on the reproductive system, right? With marijuana use. It'll screw around with your menstrual cycle if you have one of those. Well, not all of you do, right? I'm going out on a limb here, and I could probably guess at least who I know doesn't have a menstrual cycle. And I could, with a fair amount of certainty, guess who does. I think, right? I mean, barring some sort of, medical issue that I don't know about and don't want to know about. I could probably guess. There seems to be also a decrease in like free-floating testosterone levels too, if you use marijuana. And again, we're talking about like heavy users, right? So like, don't think like, wow, I smoked that marijuana one time, I'm never going to grow a beard again. Right, Jake? I mean, that's the biggest deterrent for you, to not use marijuana. It's like, I have this awesome beard and I don't want to lose it. So, not really a problem there. But it doesn't really seem to have an effect on male fertility, but it can. So maybe, yeah, we should have thought about this earlier, Cassie. Don't smoke marijuana to try to get pregnant, because it'll screw around with your menstrual
Well,
cycle.
what will it do? Will it just make your periods like 10 times worse?
They're irregular.
Like a zillion cramps for days.
If that'll keep you off the drugs, yeah. That's what it does.
I
You have
mean,
the
they
torpedo.
know.
Huh?
You have the torpedo.
If you have the torpedo.
I was gonna ask about something I just saw.
Sure.
So I saw like epigenetic effects and like I think it was in a web box or it might have been what I was reading for mine about like the activational effect of like triggering schizophrenia.
Yeah.
Like it's not, this isn't a dopaminergic drug and like if schizophrenia is implicated in dopamine, like do you know how that works at all?
That's a great question. Really, I didn't think too much about that. I know I saw the word schizophrenia here somewhere. Who knows where it was? You know, I really don't know the mechanisms that start that. I mean, schizophrenia is, you're right, it's typically, we think about that as a dopaminergic, and we don't typically think about marijuana as being a dopaminergic drug. But those epigenetic effects, so part of what will can sort of trigger, you know, schizophrenia can be genetic issues, right? And when we're thinking about epigenetics, I know some of you get really excited about this. You start to think about like methylation and histones and whether or not certain genes are exposed, right? And whether or not you can encode those. And so it's quite possible that what I would imagine is that the cannabinoids would change some of those histones and open up parts of the genome that haven't been, you know, transcribed before, and you might start making proteins that are maybe, you know, you can make receptors that are more or less sensitive, or you can release more. I'm not really sure the mechanisms on that, but it is sort of a fascinating aspect. Another reason to stay off the marijuana, right? So you don't get schizophrenia. Now I'll look into that. I'll see if I can figure out some more information. That's a pretty fascinating concept. See, there was like 4 slides here on synthetic marijuana, and you guys were just like an hour on that.
It's Jesse's fault.
I
He died. What? I mean.